Isabel Allende, House of the Spirits, Part 14. And drugged by Dr. Cuevas, who did not attend. Out of consideration for everyone who had tried to spare her this additional suffering, she said nothing that would indicate she knew about the hair-raising affair of the lost head. But once the funeral was over and life appeared to return to normal again, Clara convinced Ferrula to go out with her to look for it, and there was no use in her sister-in-law giving her more pills and potions, because she was firm in her determination. Defeated, Ferrula understood that it was no longer possible to say that the image of the lost head was a bad dream, and that it would be best if she helped Clara with her plans before her anxiety completely unhinged her. They waited for Esteban Chiriba to leave the house. Ferrula helped her dress and called for a hired carriage. Clara's instructions to the driver were rather imprecise. "Go straight, I'll tell you the route," she said, guided by her instincts for seeing what was invisible. They left the city and came into the open country where the houses were far apart and the hills and gentle valleys began. At Clara's command, they turned onto a service road and continued among the birches and onion fields until she ordered the driver to pull up along a clump of underbrush. "It's here," she said. "But that's impossible. We're much too far from where the accident occurred," said Ferrula. "It's here," Clara insisted, getting out of the car with difficulty, holding up her enormous belly. She was followed by her sister-in-law, who was muttering prayers, and by the driver, who did not have the foggiest idea of the purpose of their trip. She tried to make her way through the brush, but the twins made it impossible. "Do me a favor, senor," she said to the driver. "Step through here and hand me that woman's head that you see lying on the ground." He inched his way beneath the thorny underbrush until he came upon Nevia's head, which looked like a lonely melon. He picked it up by the hair and took it with him, crawling on all fours. While the man leaned against a tree and vomited, Ferrula and Clara cleaned the dirt and pebbles that had got into Nevia's ears, nose, and mouth, and arranged her hair, which had become rather unkempt, but they were unable to close her eyes. They wrapped the head in a shawl and returned to the car. "Hurry, senor," Clara told the driver. "I think I'm giving birth." They arrived at the house just in time to get the mother into bed. Ferrula fluttered about with all the necessity preparations, while a servant went to fetch Dr. Cuevas and the midwife. With the bouncing of the car, the emotions of the past few days, and the doctor's potions, Clara had acquired a skill at giving birth that she did not have the first time around. She clenched her teeth, grabbed onto the mizzen and foremast of the sailboat, and gave herself fully to the task of bringing forth onto the calm blue silken sea the twins, Jamie and Nicholas, who came sailing out under the gaze of their grandmother, staring open-eyed at them from the bureau. Ferrula grabbed each of them by the lock of wet hair and their napes and helped to pull them out with the experience she had acquired watching and the birth of colts and calves at Tres Marias. Before the doctor and midwife could arrive, she hid Nivea's head beneath the bed to avoid having to invent awkward explanations. When they finally arrived, there was precious little for them to do, because the mother was resting comfortably and the babies, as tiny as 7-month-olds, but with all their parts and in good condition, were sleeping in the arms of their debilitated aunt. Nivea's head became a problem because there was no place to put it without it being seen. Finally, Ferrula wrapped it in a cloth and placed it in a hat box. They discussed the possibility of giving it a proper burial, but it would have required interminable paperwork to have the tomb unsealed in order to include the missing part. Besides, there would be an uproar if word got out about how Claire had found the head where the bloodhounds had failed. Esteban Trueba, ever fearful of public ridicule, opted for a solution that would not provide material for malicious tongues, because he knew that his wife's strange behavior was the target of local gossip. It had gone beyond Clara's skill at moving objects without touching them and at predicting the impossible. Someone had uncovered the story of Clara's childhood muteness and the curse of Father Restrepo, that saintly man who the church was hoping would become the first in the country to obtain beatitude. The 2 years in Tres Marias had helped to quell the rumors, and people had begun to forget, but Trueba knew that it would take a mere trifle such as the affair of his mother-in-law's head for the whispers to start up again. For this reason, and not out of neglect, or, as was later said, the hat box was stowed away in the basement where it awaited a more propitious moment to be given a Christian burial. Clara recovered quickly from the double birth. She entrusted the care of the children to her sister-in-law and to Nana, who came to work in the Treba household after the death of her employers, to continue working for the same blood, as she put it. She had been born to cradle other people's children, wear hand-me-down clothing, eat their leftovers, live on borrowed happiness and grief, grow old beneath other people's roofs, die one day in her miserable little room in the far courtyard in a bed that did not belong to her, and be buried in a common grave in the public cemetery. She was nearly 70, but her zeal was unbending. She was still tireless in her comings and goings, untouched by time, still able to dress up as a ghost and jump on Clara in the nooks and crannies of the house, whenever she had another of her spells of muteness, still strong enough to fight with the twins and soft-hearted enough to spoil Blanca, just as she had spoiled her mother and grandmother before her. She had acquired the habit of constantly mumbling prayers under her breath, because when she realized that no one in the house believed in God, she took it upon herself to pray for all the living members of the family, as well as, of course, for the dead, for whom her devotions were simply an extension of the service she had rendered while they were alive. In her old age, she forgot whom she was praying for, but she kept up the habit, convinced that it would be of use to someone. Her piety was the only thing she shared with Fionnuala. In everything else they were rivals. One Friday afternoon, 3 translucent ladies knocked at the door of the big house on the corner. They had eyes like sea mist, covered their heads with old-fashioned flower hats, and were bathed in a strong scent of wild violets, which infiltrated all the rooms, and left the house smelling of flowers for days after their visit. They were the 3 Mora sisters. Clara was in the garden and appeared to have been waiting for them all that afternoon. She greeted them with a baby at each breast, and Blanca playing at her feet. They looked at each other, recognized each other, smiled at each other. It was the beginning of a passionate spiritual relationship that was to last the remainder of their lives, and, if their predictions have ever come true, must still be flourishing in the hereafter. The 3 Morris sisters were students of spiritualism and supernatural phenomenon. Thanks to a photograph that showed the 3 of them around a table with a misty, winged ectoplasm flying overhead, which some unbelievers attributed to a stain from the developer and others to a simple photographic trick, they were the only people who possessed irrefutable proof that souls can take on a physical form. Via mysterious connections available only to initiates, they learned of Clara's existence, established telepathic contact with her, and immediately realized they were astral sisters. By way of a series of discreet inquiries, they managed to obtain her earthly address and arrived at her door with decks of cards impregnated with beneficent liquids, several sets of geometric figures, and mysterious tools of their own invention for unmasking fake parapsychologists, and a tray of ordinary pastries as a gift for Clara. They became intimate friends, and from that day on, they met every Friday to summon spirits and exchange recipes and premonitions. They discovered a way to transmit mental energy from the big house on the corner to the other extreme of the city, where the Moras lived in an old mill they had converted into their singular abode, and also in the opposite direction, which enabled them to give each other moral support in difficult moments of their daily lives. The Moras knew many people, almost all of them interested in such matters, who gradually began to attend the Friday meetings, to which they brought their knowledge and their magnetic fluids. Esteban Trueba would see them crossing through his house, and insisted on these very few conditions: that they respect the library, that they not use the children for psychic experiments, and that they be discreet, because he did not want any public scandal. Fionnuala disapproved of these activities of Clara's. To her they seemed at odds with religion and good manners. She observed their sessions from a prudent distance, without participating, but watching them from the corner of her eye while she crocheted, ever ready to intervene in case Clara went too far in one of her trances. They had noticed that her sisters-in-law were always exhausted at the end of the sessions where she served as a medium, and she would begin to speak in pagan tongues, and in a voice that was not her own. Nana also kept her eye out on the pretext of serving little cups of coffee, startling the spirits with her starched petticoats and the click of her whispered prayers and loose teeth, not to protect Clara from her own excess, but rather to make sure no one stole the ashtrays. In vain, Clara explained to her that the guests were not interested in ashtrays, primarily because none of them smoked, but Nana had already made up her mind that they were all, with the exception of the 3 enchanting Moore sisters, a bunch of evangelical scoundrels. Nana and Farola despised each other. They squabbled over the children's affection and fought for the right to care for Clara in her rantings and ravings. Their silent, continuous war was conducted in the kitchens, the courtyards, the hallways, but never near Clara, because the 2 of them had agreed to spare her that particular anguish. Farola had come to love Clara with a jealous passion that resembled that of a demanding husband more than it did a sister-in-law. With time she lost her prudence and began to let her adoration show in many ways that did not go unobserved by Esteban. Whenever he returned from the country, Farah would manage to persuade him that Clara was in what she called one of her bad spells, so that he could not sleep in the same bed with her, and would enter the room rarely and then only briefly. She would buttress her argument with recommendations from Dr. Cuevas, which later, when he was asked point blank, turned out to have been made up. She found 1,000 ways to come between the husband and wife, and if all else failed, she would encourage the children to beg their father to take them on an outing, their mother to read them a book, or both parents to watch over them because they had a fever, or to play with them. Poor things, she would say. They need their father and their mother. They spend the whole day with that ignorant old woman who fills their heads with outmoded ideas. She's making them into imbeciles with her superstition. What we should do with Nana is put her away. People say the handmaidens of God have a marvelous asylum for old housekeepers. They treat them like real ladies. They don't have to work, there's good food. That's the most humane thing we could do. Poor Nana, she's all used up. Without being able to pinpoint the cause, Esteban began to feel uncomfortable in his own house. His wife had grown increasingly remote, strange, and inaccessible. There was no way for him to reach her, not even with presents. His timid show of affection did not work, nor did the unbridled passion that always overcame him in her presence. In all that time, his love for her had grown to the point where it had become an obsession. He wanted Clara to think of nothing but him, and he could not bear for her to have a life outside that did not include him. He wanted her to tell him everything and to know nothing he had not given her with his own hands, and to own nothing he had not given her with his own hands. He wanted her to be completely dependent. But reality was different. Clara seemed to be flying in an airplane like her uncle Marcos, unmoored from land, seeking God through Tibetan sciences, consulting spirits with a 3-legged table that gave little jolts, 2 for yes, 3 for no, deciphering messages from other worlds that could give her the forecast for rain. Once they announced that there was a hidden treasure beneath the chimney. First she had the wall knocked down, and then, when it was not found, the staircase and half of the main sitting room. Still nothing. Finally, it turned out that the spirit, confused by the architectural alterations she had made to the house, was unable to detect that the hiding place of the gold doubloons was not in the Choreba mansion, but across the street at the house of the Ugartes, who refused to demolish their dining room because they did not believe the story about the Spanish ghost. Clara was incapable of braiding Blanca's hair for school, a task she entrusted to Varilla or Nana, but she had a wonderful relationship with her, based on the same principles as the relationship she had with Nivea. They told each other stories, read the magic books from the enchanted trunks, consulted family portraits, told anecdotes about uncles who let fly great amounts of wind, and others blind who fell like gargoyles from poplar trees. They went out to look at the Cordelia and count the clouds. They spoke in a made-up language with no T's and with R's instead of L's, so that they sounded just like the man in the Chinese laundry. Meanwhile, Jamie and Nicholas were growing up again, apart from the feminine dyad, adhering to the then common belief that we have to become men. The twins grew strong and cruel in the games of typical of their age. They chased lizards to slice off their tails, mice to make them run races, and butterflies to wipe powder from their wings. When they were older, they punched and kicked each other on instructions from the Chinese laundryman, who was ahead of his time and had been the first to introduce the country to the millennial practice of the martial arts. No one had paid any attention when he demonstrated how he could split bricks in two with his hand and had tried to open his own academy, so he ended up washing other people's clothes. Years later, the twins put the finishing touches on their manhood by escaping from school and dividing into the empty lot behind the garbage dump, where they traded some of their mother's silverware for a few minutes of forbidden love with an enormous woman who cradled them, both of them in breasts like those of a Dutch cow, drowning them in the soft wetness of her armpits, crushing them with her elephantine thighs, and sending them both to heaven with the dark, hot, juicy cavern of her sex. But that was not until much later, and Clara never knew about it, so she could not write it in her notebooks that bore witness to life for me to read one day. I found out from other sources. Clara had no interest in domestic matters. She wandered from one room to the next without ever being the least surprised to find everything in perfect order and sparkling clean. She sat down to eat without ever knowing who had cooked the food or where it had come from, just as she was oblivious to the person serving it. She forgot the names of the servants and even of her own children, yet she always managed to be present like a cheerful, beneficent spirit at whose slightest footfall clocks began to wind themselves. She dressed in white because she had decided it was the only color that did not change her aura, in simple dresses that Ferula made for her on the sewing machine, and that she preferred to the ruffled, sequined gowns her husband bought with the aim of showing her off in the latest fashions. Esteban had bouts of despair because Clara treated him with the same kindness she displayed toward everybody else. She spoke to him in the same cajoling tones she used to address her cats, and was incapable of telling her that whether he was tired, sad, euphoric, or eager to make love. However, from the color of his rays, she knew at a glance whether he was hatching a swindle, and she could diffuse one of his tantrums with a few simple mocking words. It exasperated him that Clara never seemed truly grateful for anything, and never seemed to need anything that he could give her. She was as distracted and as smiling in bed as she was in everything else, relaxed and simple, but absent. He knew that her body was his to engage in all the acrobatics he had learned in the books kept hidden in a corner of his library, but with Clara even the most abominable contortions were like the thrashings of a newborn. It was impossible to spice them up with salt of evil or the pepper of submission. In a rage, Dribas sometimes reverted to his former sins, rolling with some robust peasant woman in the tall rushes of the river bank, while Clara stayed behind with the children in the city, and he had to tend to the hacienda in the country. But instead of reliving them, these episodes only left a bitter taste in his mouth. They brought no lasting pleasure, particularly since he knew that if he told his wife about them, she would be appalled by his mistreatment of the other woman, but not by his infidelity to her. Jealousy, like many other typical human reactions, was simply not part of Claire's vocabulary. He also went to the Red Lantern a few times, but he stopped going because he could not perform any more with prostitutes, and he had to swallow his humiliation by stammering various excuses. He had drunk too much wine, he had eaten too much at lunch, had been walking around with a cold for several days. Nor did he return to Transito Soto because he sensed that she embodied the real danger of addiction. He felt a terrible desire boiling up within him, a fire impossible to quench, a thirst for Clara that would never, even on the longest and most passionate nights, be satisfied. He fell asleep exhausted, his heart on the verge of bursting in his chest, but even in his dreams he was aware that the woman sleeping by his side was not really there. She was in some unknown other dimension where he could never reach her. At times he would lose his patience and furiously shake her awake, shouting the worst accusations he could think of, but then he would end up weeping in her lap and begging her forgiveness for his cruelty. Clara understood, but there was nothing she could do. Esteban Trueba's exaggerated love for her was without a doubt the most powerful emotion of his life, greater by far than his rage and pride. Half a century later he would still be speaking of it with the same shudder and the same sense of urgency. In his old man's bed, he would continue to call her name until the day he died. Ferrula's comments increased Esteban's anxiety. Every obstacle his sister placed between himself and Clara drove him out of his mind. He came to hate his own children for taking all their mother's time. He took Clara on a second honeymoon to the same places where they had spent their first, and on weekend escapades to a hotel, but it was all useless. He was convinced that Ferrula was entirely to blame, that she had planted an evil seed in his wife to prevent her from loving him, and that she was stealing forbidden kisses that properly belonged to him. He would grow livid with anger when he came upon Ferrula giving Clara a bath. He grabbed the sponge from her hands, thrust her out the room, and pulled Clara from the tub practically in midair. He gave her a good shaking and forbade her to let herself be bathed again, because at her age it was a vice, and he dried her off himself, wrapping her in her robe and leading her to the bed, feeling all the while that he was acting like a fool. If Ferrula tried to serve his wife a cup of chocolate, he grabbed it from her hands in the pretext that she was treating her like an invalid. If she kissed her good night, he pulled her away with a sweep of his hand, saying that it was not right for them to kiss. If she chose the best portions for her from the serving tray, he rose from the table in a temper. Brother and sister became rivals, each scrutinizing the other, and with eyes full of hatred, concocting fine-edged arguments to disqualify each other in Clara's eyes, spying on each other and growing ever more jealous.